Hello, and welcome to our session. We're going to make sense of how software is taxed in this session. But I'd like to point out at the beginning two things that are true. The compliance picture for software is very complex. And yes, software is something we use to solve complexity. So that's ironic. To set the scene, software is driving a lot of growth and acceleration of business and industries. So it makes sense that software companies are growing rapidly as well. Growth is great for business, but not for tax obligations. We're going to discuss this today. Please welcome our guest. From Atlassian, Senior Manager of Global Indirect Tax, Ewelina Specjal, and our own VP of Tax Research at Avalara, Courtney. Hello to both of you. I am excited to have this conversation with you both today. I'm going to start us off on the subject of nexus. I want to talk, Ewelina, with you first. What do you think are the biggest challenges around nexus?
I think there's a couple of challenges when it comes to nexus. The main one I would say is just figuring out how to monitor your nexus exposure, how to have a good handle on where your business has operations, where the sales volumes are, and where your obligations are to register where your products, services are taxable. Especially if you have a company with a global footprint,
Yes.
Managing all these jurisdictions and understanding, where your teams are going into, that can be challenging. So you definitely need a good internal process to monitor that, to evaluate that. Good communication coming from your finance teams,
Yes.
and then good understanding of regulatory requirements in different taxing jurisdictions. And that can be challenging, right? Each country can have its own rules, and especially for software and digital services, like what's taxable, what's not, and how they defined digital services. And that's another challenge to me with Nexus is maybe in many cases I see a limited guidance from taxing jurisdiction for software, or a little bit of an outdated language that sometimes is used when we discuss software.
Those are great points. Courtney, I want to explore with you a little bit about what Ewelina touched on about the taxability issue. So first, if you have triggered nexus, you have to figure out what type of product you actually are selling.
Right, and that's definitely a challenge in the software industry. As most people watching probably understand, there's different nuances about the software that can change taxability, whether it's custom or pre-written, whether it's downloaded or remotely accessed. So all these things can factor in. And then if you layer into that services that can be provided along with the sales software, such as implementation or support type services. So these can all, states all treat these things differently, and they can all change the taxability. So it makes it difficult when you're looking at nexus. When you're going into a new state, you really have to dig into that state's rules because there's not a consistency across states.
Yes, for sure. Many of those things are difficult, categorizing them. And as Ewelina, as you pointed out, the language around this is antiquated in many jurisdictions. It doesn't reflect the reality of this industry currently. There's a lot of difficulty, right, in this area. There's no doubt it's difficult to stay on track. It's difficult to filter all the information. And it's difficult to even know whether you have a taxing jurisdiction nexus, whether you've triggered nexus when you're growing really, really fast. But another area that I want to explore with you is how do you keep your internal finance teams plugged in, right? They're the ones responsible for filing, registering, as you pointed out, Courtney, and then, deciding whether they need to apply tax to a particular invoice with the customer. So how do you stay in sync with your finance teams at Atlassian, Ewelina?
Yeah, I mean, all new registrations are really driven by the tax team, right? So we are the decision maker there. We make that determination, and then we work very closely with our finance IT team to make sure the systems are set up and ready to go when we're ready to go. And but yeah, where it comes to more on the front end, I would say the product development teams, the sales teams, the pricing teams, right? They're the ones that are actively working on figure out how to package your product, what types of new services we can offer, especially in software, right? They're getting very creative. New licensing agreements, and how to bundle services, and that can have, that obviously is impacted by transaction tax, by indirect tax. So it's good for us to have a window into what they're doing, and then I think it really aids their decision making too when they're, sometimes they don't think about tax and they don't think that it might have implications.
I think that's a key point you made about being a two-way street, right? It helps their decision making when they're connected with the tax teams and they understand what that impact is. Courtney, have you had similar experiences in staying connected with the internal finance teams?
Yeah, I think probably the worst case scenario is when tax is the last to know about a new product or service, and it's a new type of product, but maybe research needs to be done. So I have been part of that, and really I think in my experience, getting tax as a kind of a step in the price management product development stage, that having tax be a sign off or a step that has to be reviewed by tax, then that's a way to make sure that you've seen the products and services, that you've evaluated them, determined, how to treat them for tax. So yeah, I mean, I think that, and then having relationships with people in the product management area that can really help explain to you in layman's terms what the products and services are. I know sometimes that's a struggle to just try to define in simple terms what this is, how you could explain it to an auditor or somebody outside the company. So just having that connection with somebody internally that can help with that as well.
I think those are really good points from both of you. People and process, right? Strong relationships, and then a sign-off process is a really good suggestions on how to stay connected. I want to turn our attention to sourcing. I think sourcing is such a fascinating area. I really think it's more difficult than Nexus. It's complicated. Where in the world do you source a software product that can be accessed anywhere? And a recent example, I took a trip to Quebec, and on my way back, I accessed Netflix. And I don't exactly know where I was, somewhere over North America, or it could have been in, I don't know if I was in Canada, the US. But as I was watching the streaming content, my mind started to wonder, tax nerd, and I'm like, how in the world are they sourcing this? How do they know where the end user is? I don't even know where I'm at, right? And so I'm curious, Ewelina, from your point of view, how do you deal with sourcing at Atlassian?
It's definitely a challenging act, right? It's a little more complicated for companies that have, sell services than if you just have a product that ships and you know exactly where it gets delivered, right? For us, we definitely, we look at the requirements within each country of how they define where service is consumed or, revenue is sourced in their specific jurisdiction. A lot of the countries, they point to IP address of the customer. So they're trying to pinpoint the geolocation of the customer. That can be challenging, right, for seller to track. We don't necessarily track all IP of our customers, and our ERP system might not be equipped to kind of point to that for tax calculation. But that's something that gets listed a lot as a requirement. Some jurisdictions will mention credit card. So if you use a credit card of that country to transact, that would be something they look at for connecting transaction to their country. And then there's more typical like bill to address, and I think that's what most companies and Atlassian kind of looks to. So the bill to address of the customer is the easiest to track, and we at least part of the information we are able to gather from the customer, right. When they pay. But yeah, it's challenging. Even within different countries, they have their specific like nuances. But for me, sourcing has another layer of complexity when you have licenses that you sell to a customer, like multiple licenses.
Yes.
And you have to think about, well, where are they going to be sent to, right? The firm can have employees in many states, many countries, and we don't always have that information when we sell or where our customer is going to be using those licenses. And even our customers, I don't think always know where they're going to distribute the licenses to.
No, as you point out, there's so many variations, and you don't always know where the end use is going to occur. Even the purchaser doesn't always know. But one big thing is ERP systems, right? They have limitations to data storage. And the example I use, Netflix, they don't have my address. Now, I don't know if that's a limitation on their ERP or a preference, a privacy preference, but they just have my zip code. And so what's your particular experience with sourcing and these difficulties, Courtney?
Yeah, so it's definitely an area that's not well defined, just particularly in the software, digital goods area. It's, from the use tax perspective, we help a lot of clients with their use tax on these types of purchases. And these are large purchases, software. So, I mean, they can be spending tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And even for the purchaser side, there's, especially with the remote employees right now, they could be scattered all throughout the country. Even the purchaser, like Ewelina said, may not know where these licenses are being used. So generally, we just try to take a reasonable allocation based on, some type of payroll numbers, offices where the type of software is going to be used. If it's used, if it's general ledger type software, then it would be used in all their offices. If it's manufacturing type software, it would just be used in manufacturing facilities. So just try to take a reasonable approach for allocation.
Yes. The reasonableness test, it's often cited in many court opinions on topics. SST is trying to address this issue. The governing board has just put forward a proposal that uses zip codes. And it's quite controversial. Zip codes aren't taxing jurisdictions, they're postal delivery routes. And so they can hit many different jurisdictions when you use a postal delivery route. The proposal before the SST is to use the highest tax rate that's in that particular postal route. It's a little bit of a simplified way to approach the problem. It addresses the limitations that ERPs have, but there are many objections to taking this approach. Ewelina, I'm curious what your opinion is on this proposal.
I mean, it's good to see that SST is looking at this and that there's some discussion and that they're trying to solve for things. It'll be interesting to watch if, which states agree to this in the end. Obviously, they're trying to be more conservative and apply the highest tax rate, but there is a risk of overcharging customer. I would be worried in those jurisdictions that do require that you apply like a local tax rate, and especially for filing purposes, if you have to, in practicality, fill out a tax form that asks you for location. How do you do that? So I don't know, like if all jurisdictions will be able to do that under SST. Seems like there would be more work that would have to be done on their tax filing side, which might be tricky. But going deeper into this, I don't know that it really solves a lot of problems for us when it comes to sourcing. Again, going back to having, multiple custom, like multiple uses within one sale, right? We just recently had a customer ask us to split our sale across like hundreds of employees that they have for licenses they were purchasing. And I mean, it's, I don't think practically you can really execute that. You're asking to have an invoice of one line split into hundreds of lines for tax purpose calculation. And I think even if you just have a zip code, that seems really difficult.
Yes, good points. Courtney, what are your thoughts on this proposal?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly using the highest tax rate for a zip code, is not ideal for your customers, and you hate to be overtaxing, have a solution that ends up overtaxing your customers. So, and then there's the compliance issue of just which jurisdictions, how do you allocate that out? So yeah, I don't know that it solves is a complete solution.
Yeah, sourcing is tough. I do think it's tougher than Nexus. I'm curious, Ewelina, how, I think sourcing does come up also in the context of income tax quite frequently. Have you seen this issue as well, Ewelina?
Yeah, we definitely seen this. And just in recent few days, I've seen a case in Texas, right? I think there's been a big development. Texas Supreme Court overturned an appeals court decision.
Yes, I
think
saw
it was
that.
XM Series, regarding where services were performed for apportionment purposes. So that's maybe more on the income tax side, but it definitely, I think, spills over to indirect tax. And it's interesting to see that even within, one state's tax ruling bodies, there is differences in how they interpret sourcing.
Yes.
So just to show everyone how complex this can be.
Yeah, the G20 has put forward a proposal around a global tax, and they've started to proclamate rules around sourcing those incomes, particularly when you're involved in digital transactions. And it'll be interesting. I do think those rules could be instructive for sourcing digital properties with respect to indirect tax as well. So something for us to all keep our eyes on. We've talked about Nexus.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ewelina. No, jump in.
It'll be interesting. No, I was just gonna say, it'll be definitely interesting to watch.
Yeah. I am interested to see what they put forward for sure. We've talked about Nexus. We've talked about classifying products so that we know how they'll be taxed. We've talked about sourcing. These are all very difficult areas. Are there any other thoughts that either of you have, Ewelina or Courtney, on this topic? Ewelina, I'll let you go first.
I think I definitely see jurisdictions being more creative and I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but they're definitely going after more revenue that software tech companies have, right? And finding new ways to tax it. And we see kind of new tax types coming up that we haven't seen before. Right. On the globals platform, we see DST taxes, so the digital service taxes. It's kind of a new thing of taxing revenue of software companies, and then taxing advertising revenue, which is really interesting. Like, how do you source that, right? Where your advertising dollars are coming from based on where customers are logging into from where. And I think Maryland is the first state in the U.S. that's trying to tap into that and tax advertising. So yeah, definitely something to look out for in the software tech industry. I was reading up about new things that states are trying to do and that they're getting challenged in court by software companies. Right. And something that we haven't really talked about, but I would say making sure companies have good grasp on exemption certificates that they're getting from their customers. Or that they track, that they store their VAT numbers, GST numbers of customers so that they apply tax properly. And when they evaluate a nexus in the jurisdiction, that, right. Understanding the B2B sales versus B2C sales and the reverse charges, that comes into play too when you look at the volumes of sale you might have.
Yes. Courtney, what about you? Any other thoughts on those topics?
And I think just staying proactive as a tax department, really understanding the long-term growth plan for the company, and try to stay on top of what types of products and services are going to be introduced, as well as where the growth is going to occur.
Right. I think you hit on something, the complex, staying connected with your tax department. I know there's a lot of frustration often with revenue agencies. I have a long history coming out of the regulatory area, and it's simply not easy for them. Their authority is limited by the legislation, and they rely on legislators to act, timely and to update legislation, which is also challenging in our system, and there's lots of lobbying that goes on. And so it's not easy, and that lack of guidance really does make it that much more difficult. It makes things very, very difficult. Have either of you had experience with any of these issues coming up in the M&A process and in due diligence? Ewelina, have you seen this come up in any due diligence you've been a part of?
Yeah, definitely something you see a lot with software companies, and I've had opportunity to work through a couple M&As with Atlassian, and it's important to have a playbook, right, for your pre-acquisition due diligence, so you know what to look for. You can quantify the risk for the management and point it out, and also prepare for post-acquisition work that needs to be done. And yeah, with software companies, especially the smaller ones, they have a great product, they grow really fast, they have amazing teams, but tax is not really something that they think about, right?
For sure. Yes.
They, sometimes they don't really, they haven't really thought about it at all. So as a bigger company with an actual tax department, it's good to aid them in that process when the company gets acquired.
Courtney, did you see this come up in M&A that you've been a part of?
Yeah, so you definitely want to know where your risks are and be prepared. The last thing you want is for sales tax to be an issue in a deal. And we actually help some clients with post-acquisition or mergers. We help them really when you have two companies that combine and they're selling similar type of products. You want to make sure that you're on the same page about how those products and services are taxed. So there's the reconciliation work of making sure that the entire portfolio of products and services is taxed similarly across all the different companies that may be part of a consolidated group.
For sure. We've talked about the complexity. There are things that software can do to make that easier. Courtney, how have you seen software help solve software companies' challenges with tax compliance?
Yeah, so I think having some type of software solution that can feed the tax rules and keep those rules up to date is really necessary for staying on top of all the changes that are occurring right now.
Yes. Ewelina, how about you? How have you guys used software at Atlassian to help you with tax compliance?
I mean, software is definitely an integral part for us, right? I can't imagine, trying to use our own ERP system or doing some manual calculations across, all our products and services. So it's very important to have a great partner that, will aid your calculation and that you can rely on, that, the rate, and not just the rate, but the tax determination is correct, right? So that, if something is exempt or, that will be tracked and done correctly. So it's very important. And then the tools for research, which we talked about a little bit, that's another part where software comes into play. Very important, makes our lives much easier. I can't imagine in today's world, not having that.
For sure. Well, Ewelina, Courtney, it's been great fun. I appreciate you joining me today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.